This is an update for the research portion of the apprenticeship course that I am doing this summer. The idea is to get a publishable paper based on a dissertation that was completed a few years ago by Paul James Birch. And that dissertation is entitled Testing Mediated Effects of a Sex Education Program on Youth Sexual Activity. And that was completed at Utah State in 2011. So one of the things I've wanted to do is just familiarize myself with the overall picture and see what the most up-to-date data indicate as far as youth sexual activity, pregnancy, STDs. Just get a readout of, well, what's the current dynamic that exists. So what I've done so far is just starting in Chapter 1, Statement of the Problem. It has just gone through and looked for any updates of the data. So for instance, as we begin the statement of the problem, 8% of U.S. teenage girls become pregnant each year, and then the citation is given for that. I looked to see if that data had been updated. I was able to find some updated data from 2011, which would put that figure at 5%. Sort of done a system here where I put little notes. I put notes at the end of these citations with relevant information that may be useful. So continuing on here, sexually transmitted diseases are also a substantial problem for youth, with 1 in 4 U.S. teens having an STD and rates rising rapidly in recent years. And so I looked for information for the most up-to-date information on STDs. And then we have here the cost of STDs in the U.S. is estimated at $6.5 billion annually. So updated data there puts that figure more around the $15.6 billion range, a substantial increase of what that estimate is. So we have talking about federal funding here and the debate on abstinence-only education and comprehensive. This is from 2010. I was able to find a study here from 2016. Okay, so getting through sort of the first part of that dissertation where we lays out a picture of what our problem is and the function for needing to do this research. What is it that we're highlighting? If we do the method of looking at it from, okay, here's the problem with teen pregnancy and STDs, and we need an abstinence program. If it's about needing an abstinence program and that argument versus we don't really understand up to now how to fully account for the effectiveness of programs. So this is about trying to figure out how we account for that effect using, the sort of mathematical modeling or research design. So in that sense, it could be more of a paper about a methodology than it is about the topic itself per se. One of the things that I find helpful in finding a direction is kind of understanding what the big picture is, and I didn't really know exactly what the trends were doing as far as teen pregnancy rates over time. But I was kind of surprised that the number had gone down from 2011 to now, so I was trying to understand, okay, so what does the bigger picture look like? Led me to wondering, well, what does the long-term trend line, what has our trend line been like for the past 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, or how far does the data go? So doing a search, I was able to find some figures from the United Nations Population Division. So this line here represents our aggregate data, I guess you could say, of what the trend line has done since 1960. And as we can see, there has been quite a decrease, and it has been pretty consistent. I'm not even sure that there has been a period where we've actually seen an increase in that rate. So that, I guess, gives some global context, and then I wanted to see, well, what is the United States doing? So now just looking at the United States, and again, what we're looking at here is adolescent fertility rate. That's births per 1,000 women, ages 15 through 19. So in other words, teen pregnancy rates. 1960, that rate's at 81.75. Here's 1960, and here's the last data point from 2017, so a couple years ago. And obviously we can see that's quite a substantial decrease over time. We've got this little rise here, we have a peak right there at 92, and since 92 to today, we've seen a pretty sharp decline. When I look at this graph, one of the things that I think of is how someone might want to interpret this. What arguments are people going to make to explain this or account for this? And this is, of course, the eternal question in social sciences: correlation, causation. That we can see the trend is going down is one thing, but why, what accounts for that is another. Now, I guess we could say in the meta picture, or the big view, if we were looking at this as data for any experimental design, and we said, here is our start baseline, and here's our outcome, and over a 50-year treatment intervention, here's what happened, would we say that that was effective? Did the treatment method produce significant effects? Can we conclude that's effective? And I guess that's where sort of this complexity starts to emerge with this picture, is how do we figure out what is actually affecting this? One way of approaching this is to divide this up into political administrations, right? So we could look here at 1980. So from 80 to 84, we have Ronald Reagan. From 84 to 88, I think we have Reagan again. And Reagan gets out of office here. This region here, that represents George Bush Sr. This represents when Clinton comes into the White House. And we can see from that point it goes down. So again, the causation correlation question is whatever is happening with the Clinton administration reversing the trend that was happening under the George Bush administration. Someone who's going to argue that, let's say, abstinence only is ineffective might use this as a way to make that argument. George Bush in office, and he was allowed to implement his methods, and then look what happened when Clinton was in. So if we go further down that trend line now to 2000, we get the election of George Bush. So 9/11 happens around here. So Bush is in office during this phase till 2008 when Obama comes in. So in other words, this here represents George Bush Jr. Someone again making that argument would say, aha, see what happens? Clinton was in, George Bush Jr. gets in, and that rate decreases less. It's still decreasing, but it's less than it was. So now if we even get more specific than that, it's, well, what's going on in the classrooms during these phases? What's going on in the classrooms? So then the next thing that I wondered was, well, what are the other rates of westernized, industrialized societies? So for example, if we were to pull up France, we can see that France has never been as high as the US. So the United States here is currently at 18. And that represents France around 82. Even though the United States has made progress from a comparison to France, it's still 3 times higher, the teen pregnancy rate. So that's still a question. Why is that 3 times higher? So I thought, well, let's pull up some more. We've got Germany in there. And we can see that one thing that's interesting is Germany is basically mirroring France. They're neighbors. Italy's doing a very similar trend. Spain. I guess a question then is, well, what are they teaching in their classrooms? Is the content in France, Germany, Italy, and Spain the same? We're seeing a similar trend, and is that because of what's going on in the classroom? A person could make the argument that the United Kingdom in some ways is sort of somewhere between the rest of Europe and the United States. It's not exactly like the United States, and it's not exactly like the rest of Europe, but it's somewhere in between. And I was curious what the data in the UK would be. Okay, so now we're looking at the UK. So the UK around this time was even higher than the US. They had a huge decline within a pretty short span here. Now for a reference from a completely different culture. So now adding in Japan, we see Japan down here, much lower than the United States, and consistent. It's going on here. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if there was no statistically significant increase. And so, then we think, well, what are they teaching in their classrooms? So seeing that Europe sort of mirrors each other, I thought, well, what's our neighbor doing? What's Canada doing? So again, now we're just looking at the United States, and let's look at what Canada is doing. So here's Canada. The thing that I find very interesting about Canada is it looks to be kind of just a scaled down version of the same general trend. So right about 92, we see that same peak and that dip. About 2002, we see that same moderate rebound. And then from this, around 2008, we see that, and these look to be converging. So from this, I can see the argument that what we're seeing in these trend lines is not a reflection per se of what's going on in the classrooms so much as what's going on in the culture. Well, what's Canada teaching in their classrooms during this phase? Is it the exact same material? So in theory, what's going on in the United States classrooms is causing this. If that's the case, then what's going on in Canadian classrooms should be causing this. Well, is the same thing going on at those same points, And that seems, in a sense, kind of unlikely, given the difference of election cycles and so forth. So it seems to me that this is maybe more consistent with painting a picture of what's going on in your culture as a whole, not necessarily what's going on in the classroom per se. I could see that someone's going to want to make an argument that the data indicate that the problem is course correcting, that the rate is going down. And if this was the data readout of any intervention, then you would conclude that whatever's going on, it's working. But now, where that doesn't necessarily hold up are the rates of sexually transmitted diseases. This could simply indicate that teens are using more birth control, but STD rates are not necessarily decreasing at the same rate that pregnancies are decreasing. And on the surface, that would seem to indicate that more girls are taking birth control and condom use is less because sexually transmitted diseases are still increasing. So that's the other thing I wanted to know is, well, what are the sexually transmitted disease rates doing? But the point here is that someone would be critical. I think someone might be skeptical of the narrative that the function of sexual education programs is to reduce teen pregnancy rates. Because in the meta-analysis, it's tempting to say, well, nothing that goes on in the classroom directly is affecting these rates because, look, Canada's doing the same thing, and Canada isn't cloning curriculum unless they are. So turning then more towards the research of what the STD picture looks like. Here we have some rates on chlamydia, which seems to be leading. This is from 2017. Rates of reported cases among women 15 to 24. And of course, that doesn't just include teens, but teens are represented within that, obviously. One thing that stands out to me is here in Utah, we apparently have the lowest rate. Of course, this is reported cases, so we don't necessarily know if this is an accurate reflection of who actually has the lowest rates. And so this is reported cases, and someone could make the argument that what's happening is that Utah is just less likely to report. The rates might not be substantially different. They're just less likely to report it. And to that, I don't really know how a person actually is able to know the difference. How would you discern that? It's tricky. One thing that has kind of stood out to me in this research process is this is tricky stuff. Now, whether or not what I've done so far is particularly relevant or germane to the paper that needs to be written, I don't really know. I've never written a paper for a journal. But it seems to me that sometimes having a fresh pair of eyes can be helpful. Sampling a survey of what the current picture looks like, and from that it might help us all, and those who obviously have more experience and expertise than I do, hopefully it may be of assistance in helping them figure out the ultimate direction and approach to take this paper in, and the pros and cons associated with each one of those methods. So that's sort of reflective of the work I've done so far on this applied portion, or rather this research portion. And it represents about 20 hours worth of research so far, and I'm not so much concerned about the time, even if I end up spending 60 hours on this or whatever. I'm more concerned about understanding the process of doing data analysis, intake, and orienting oneself in a complex issue and figuring out how do we distill that down to a paper. So I hope that this is still reflective of being consistent with the objectives of this course. And I feel that it's been incredibly helpful to me so far, even though admittedly this is pretty complex. So I look forward to further collaboration and getting this where it needs to be.